As the war in Ukraine nears its end, it is time to take stock of the events, analyze what this conclusion truly means, and assess who gained, who lost, and ultimately, who can be considered the winner of the conflict. However, in this case, there are no simple answers, as the war is part of a larger geopolitical game in which major global powers clash. This conflict carries significant security, economic, and geopolitical implications. In the aftermath of this war, the military and political landscape of the world, especially in Europe, will undergo substantial changes. However, its consequences will be felt globally, and we will now explain why. Before we continue, we want to emphasize that Warthog Defense has a clear pro-Ukrainian stance, as we believe we stand on the side of truth. Nevertheless, in this analysis, we will set aside emotions and personal sentiments to provide a factual, objective assessment of the war's conclusion and the developments that will follow. What is clear is that the war will end along the current lines of separation. This is more than evident. Regardless of the Ukrainian or Russian constitution or the statements from both sides, the new border between Russia and Ukraine will ultimately be drawn along the front lines, and both sides are well aware of this. This is precisely why both Russia and Ukraine have fought to capture as much territory as possible throughout the war. From the very beginning, they understood that when the conflict eventually ended, and it was always clear that an end would come, the land under their control would determine their final borders. It is almost certain that Ukraine will never formally recognize the occupied territories in any peace agreement. However, it will have to accept that these regions will remain under foreign control and that it will not attempt to reclaim them by force. This makes Ukraine's offensive in Kursk critically important, something we at Warthog Defense previously stated in an interview with a Ukrainian media outlet. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is a brilliant strategic move, and Russia's failure to expel Ukrainian forces from the region will significantly weaken Moscow's position in peace negotiations. Ukraine's NATO membership is also off the table, which Moscow will attempt to portray as a major strategic victory. However, this is far from the case, and here's why. Despite not joining NATO, Ukraine will retain a strong military and will almost certainly host troops from NATO member states on its territory. These forces, primarily from European countries, may not be stationed near the front lines, but their presence will serve as a powerful deterrent against any future Russian aggression. In essence, while Ukraine may not achieve formal NATO membership, it will remain deeply integrated with the alliance, benefiting from security guarantees that reinforce its sovereignty and independence. When I initially mentioned that it's difficult to explain in simplified terms who won and who lost in this war, now we can delve into why this is the case. A key question from the very beginning was, what does victory mean for each side? For Ukraine, a clear victory would have been the expulsion of Russia from all occupied territories, including Crimea. However, that possibility seemed so unrealistic that no Western leader ever explicitly stated it as a goal. Instead, the demand was for Russia to withdraw to its pre-February 2022 lines. For Russia, defining victory is equally complicated. Moscow had declared certain objectives, while others were implied through speeches and statements, and some were apparent through military operations. Let's start with Ukraine. As the obvious underdog in this conflict, Ukraine's greatest achievement is its survival as a sovereign nation. Let's not deceive ourselves. Russia's primary goal from the outset of the war was to destroy Ukraine as a state and erase the identity of the Ukrainian people. In fact, Putin himself made this clear, stating that Ukraine's very existence posed a security threat to Russia. Ukraine has undoubtedly been devastated, with its infrastructure destroyed and likely hundreds of thousands of casualties, both military and civilian. However, from this war, we will emerge with a strong and unified Ukrainian nation, something that wasn't entirely clear before the invasion. Ukrainians will have a state forged in blood, smaller than the one they had within the 1991 borders, but this time it will be a state without Russian elements, with those remaining under Russian control being limited to around 20% of the territory. Russia failed to change the Ukrainian leadership, and it's almost certain that Ukraine, as a state, will remain a bulwark in defense of Europe against Russian influence, making Kiev increasingly significant in the future. From Russia's side, it failed to achieve any of its declared or hidden military and political objectives. Militarily, Moscow experienced one of the greatest defeats in its military history. Russia was humiliated on the world stage by a much weaker opponent. The number of casualties and losses within the Russian armed forces is staggering. Whether we're talking about 500,000, 600,000, or even 1 million killed and wounded soldiers, the death toll in the Russian military is one of the highest in recent military history relative to the duration of the conflict and the geographical area where it was fought. When comparing it to the American intervention in Vietnam or the Soviet one in Afghanistan, Russia's losses are simply colossal, highlighting the incredible incompetence and unpreparedness of its armed forces in every aspect. From a territorial perspective, Russia only managed to capture the southern part of Ukraine, stretching from Mariupol to Crimea, and create a new land corridor with the peninsula. In the east, in Donbass and Luhansk, the gains were minimal. Each city captured, such as Bakhmut or Andriivka, came at an immense cost. Putin paid with tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds, even thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery, which ultimately exhausted Russia's vast Soviet-era reserves. To continue its military operations, which relied solely on endless suicidal assaults and throwing thousands of Russian soldiers into the fire, Putin had to seek help from Iran and North Korea. This was a clear sign of Russia's military impotence, further emphasizing its inability to sustain a prolonged war effort. If we look at Russia's officially declared objectives, namely the infamous denazification and demilitarization, we get an even clearer picture of Russia's military debacle. Denazification, as much as it was a fabricated term by Russian propaganda, was unfortunately accepted by some so-called intellectuals in the West, who astonishingly ignored the fact that the president of Ukraine is Jewish, and that a nation that overwhelmingly voted for a Jewish leader cannot have Nazi motivations. But this was in vain. Taking, for example, the Azov Battalion, which for many symbolizes the Nazi nature of the Ukrainian armed forces, we encounter an even greater absurdity. It must be acknowledged that Azov does have a history of Nazi-related iconography, and this is not a secret. However, it is only one military unit that likely represents only a small percentage of the total armed forces. President Zelensky has tried to address this issue in the past, but Russian aggression blocked those efforts. But let's return to Azov. When Russia captured Mariupol, it took the entire leadership of the unit, including Denis Prokopenko. What did Putin do with the main Nazi who fell into Russian hands? He simply returned him to Ukraine because he had to exchange him for his close associate Viktor Medvedchuk, who had been arrested in Ukraine earlier. Medvedchuk, according to Russian plans, was supposed to replace Zelensky. In that moment, Russia's entire narrative about denazification fell apart. The second term is demilitarization, and here things are even clearer. After the war, Ukraine will not be weaker but much stronger. Before the war, Ukraine was the 11th military power in Europe. Today, it ranks 4th by all parameters. Putin did not get a weak, unarmed Ukraine on his borders, but a strong, motivated, and armed state that will no longer fear resisting its aggressor. For all these missteps, Putin lost nearly 1 million soldiers, hundreds of billions of dollars, and Russia's military prestige has become a joke on the global stage. We must not forget that Russia also lost its influence in Syria, where it could not concentrate enough resources due to the war in Ukraine. As a result, Moscow lost its only Mediterranean port, which it had used since Soviet times. Additionally, Russia lost its grip on European energy markets and its influence in former Soviet republics in Central Asia, where China's presence is growing stronger. And now comes the final blow, the much-discussed NATO expansion. Even before the invasion in 2022, Ukrainian President Zelensky publicly stated that he was ready to discuss Ukraine's military neutrality. Had Putin taken this opportunity with an elegant move, he could have avoided much of the suffering in his country. He could have used Ukraine's military presence on the border as a bluff, and secured a massive strategic victory without disrupting the political and economic landscape of the Russian Federation. But then, overconfident Putin genuinely believed he would capture Kiev within 3 days, which turned out to be one of the greatest military mistakes in history. In the end, NATO expanded with 2 new members, Sweden and Finland, countries that had never planned to join the alliance. The other NATO members increased their military budgets and ramped up armament, creating a completely opposite effect to Russia's proclaimed goals. If we were to compare the war in Ukraine to another conflict, it would be the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland. Back then, the Finns inflicted such heavy losses on the Soviet forces that it made Hitler think that the Red Army was nothing more than a paper tiger. In the end, Finland had to give up 10% of its territory, but not due to Stalin's military success, rather because it was simply a much smaller adversary with fewer resources, which is eerily similar to Ukraine's situation today. It should be noted that the Russian propaganda about fighting NATO in Ukraine is far from true. According to the way operations were conducted, Russia would not have lasted more than a month against NATO. However, the military aid that came to Ukraine helped Kiev preserve its country. But let's be realistic. Western allies never provided Ukraine with enough weapons to win the war, only to maintain the status quo. For illustration, while Russia began the war with tens of thousands of tanks, Ukraine received around 600 tanks from the West. At the same time, the Ukrainians, taking advantage of the disorganized Russian forces, captured 1,500 Russian tanks, which ironically meant that Russia became Ukraine's largest supplier of weapons. As a conclusion, we can say that Ukraine's bravery and resistance preserved its state, serving as an example that many others should follow. Despite overwhelming odds, Ukraine stood firm, demonstrating resilience and unity in the face of aggression. This spirit of determination has not only safeguarded Ukraine's sovereignty, but also provided a powerful lesson in the value of defending one's country and values. The Ukrainian example highlights the importance of courage, solidarity, and unwavering resolve, qualities that can inspire nations around the world to protect their independence and preserve their way of life.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you want to support Warthog Defense, please become our member and get early access to new videos, exclusive members-only videos, and become administrator in comment section. The membership link is in the description.
Rescues every day. We had a guy last week, it's 6 rescues in 6 days. You know, he's doing the job every day.